I mentioned the soundness of the conclusion of an argument, and that a sound conclusion needs good reasons and good reasoning. It's helpful, I think, to understand the difference between validity and soundness, and between deductive and inductive reasoning. So let's look at those briefly before we look at forms of reasoning in law, very briefly, and then finish by reviewing once again how our hack applies to a simple argument, just to make sure that we have the whole thing in mind again before we finish. First, let's look at the difference between deductive and inductive argument. So here we see the two most common examples of argumentative forms used to illustrate the difference between deductive and inductive argument. Deductive argument, as in this famous syllogism about Socrates, moves from a general statement towards a more specialised conclusion logically derived from the truth of the reasons and the valid logical relationship between them. In this classic valid deductive form, if it is true that all men are mortal, which is the major premise, and if it is true that Socrates is a man, the minor premise, then the conclusion that Socrates is mortal is logically inevitable as a simple result of the valid structure of the argument. If the reasons are true and the form is valid, then the conclusion is sound. There are actually set examples of valid and invalid deductive forms that you can get hold of if you're interested and learn so that you can see how this works in even more depth if you want to. But the most important thing at this moment is to understand that deductive argument is either valid or invalid, and when it's valid you're necessarily driven to the conclusion as a matter of logical structure. Inductive argument, on the other hand, proceeds from a series of specific instances towards a general conclusion. In the case of this classic example, the conclusion is strong because since it is true that for every day in history the sun has risen, it's intensely likely that the sun will rise again tomorrow. But that conclusion is not a matter of logical inevitability, it's a matter of probability, in this case almost unshakable probability. Now, understanding the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning matters because inductive reasoning, by its nature, can never guarantee its conclusion. Why does this matter for us as lawyers and law students? Because inductive reasoning is very widely used in law. We're not going to go deeply into legal reasoning at this point. Just be aware that inductive reasoning is pervasive in law and that it can't guarantee its conclusion. A deductively valid argument, on the other hand, always guarantees its conclusion. The conclusion will only be sound, though, if the reasons are good. Validity is not enough to establish soundness. So the initial test for inferences is excellent, but you do need to ensure that the reasons are also reliable or true in order that you can be certain of the conclusion. So now that we have all that clear, let's revisit our hack again and then apply it to our basic argument about parental sex choice. Here's the hack, all in one tight package.